I'm talking about test automation, and today I'm not going to tell you that you have to test your code. Of course, you have to do that, but you already know that. Today I'm talking about my experience and my struggles and frustrations that I also had with testing. So it will be a more honest talk, maybe than others, about the topic that I have made before. And so I'm going to share my personal history of testing in the context of Magento in the past 6 years. And in the end, you should see that it's worth the struggle and worth learning it and doing automated testing. So my life with Magento started in 2011. I was running a small company with a friend, and one of our clients wanted to migrate his old OS commerce store to Magento. He had asked a few bigger agencies for quotes, and it was too expensive for him. So he asked us, "Can't you do this for us?" And honestly, we said, "We have no idea, but we can give it a try under certain circumstances." So we agreed that we would take over the project and do it in an agile way, looking how far we come month by month, learning as we go. And he is going to pay us a small amount per hour, but he's paying us for all the learning and doing it. This was a great way to get introduced into Magento with less stress. We sensed an opportunity there because Magento was in high demand. So I started to get my teeth into it. Luckily, that was not like 2009 or so. We already had some documentation, and the certifications were coming up. Somehow I managed to get certified within a few months. And just at this time, I also gotten into the topic of software testing. So I was eager to embrace test-driven development within Magento. And I made a test plan, and I was super excited to apply all this. Little did I know. I looked for test frameworks and tried a few. I don't know if anybody remembers the iBuilding's Mage test framework. It's not around anymore, I think. Then there was EcomDev PHPUnit that maybe many of you have heard of because it's popular within the Magento 1 space. And it also won my favor. It was advertising to make unit testing possible in Magento, and offered lots of Magento-specific testing assertions. It sounded great. So if I look back, at the time I had a little pocket notebook to write down things I learned each day, and I wanted to remember. And I went through it again, and I found this note. Sorry, it's in German, but you can't read it anyway because my handwriting. It says, "As uncomfortable as it might be, due to high error proneness from typos, unit tests for model, helper, block, classes, etc. are absolutely essential." What I meant that back in the days, there were no IDE plugins like Magento, at least I didn't know them, and no code generation tools. So it was easy to make mistakes in XML configurations and often spend hours debugging just to find out it was a typo. Because some XML element wasn't named correctly, and all the XML had to be written by heart or copy-pasted from other modules and adjusted. Both is quite error-prone, especially if you are a beginner. So this is me at the time. What the fuck? It's not consistently. So I started to write tests first for every configuration. After all, EcomDev PHPUnit provided methods for it. So here's one of the configuration tests. You don't have to look at the code. We don't have time to discuss it, just to see that I actually did write tests. So also wrote tests for things like observers, mocked all the inputs, wrote tests for controllers, and tested that the layout was rendered correctly, that it was rendering the things that I expected, the DOM of the response. I even wrote tests for my JavaScript, if I had to write JavaScript, which I tried to avoid. When I'm looking back at the first modules for Magento I did some stupid mistakes because I didn't know Magento well enough. But I still took testing and code structure super seriously. And I really wanted to do this right, and spent many hours to get the tests working. And that's what you don't see in this code, the painful process to get there. All the hidden dependencies to global state in Magento, bugs of the testing frameworks. If you look closely, you can see them in the code, because PHPUnit has this option to skip tests and mark them as skipped with a comment if they don't work for you, instead of just deleting them. And these skip tests tell a story on their own. I've searched for them in my code base and found things like this. Fatal error, what? Or conflict with fixture and existing database. It was always something with the fixtures, so it was a pain to set up test data. Or something again with a fixture, and this fixed me comment sits there for 5 years. It was never fixed. Something about PHPUnit 3.6, which was new at that time, which didn't work correctly. Or one of the favorites, it only occurs in test environment. So things that you can reproduce on one environment and not on the others were very painful too. And if it got really bad, I wrote my comments in German. Das klappt schon wieder alles nicht mit Admin-Log und Dispatch. This is me. And then there was the update to Magento 1.6, I think, and suddenly half of the tests started to fail. Some for valid reasons, so hey, cool, I had some tests that proved that something didn't work after the update, but most tests failed because just the tests didn't work anymore with the new Magento version. The code was still fine. I needed to change some mocks to reflect changes in Magento, but that was changed, that was not relevant to the code I wrote. I was not really testing in isolation, and Magento leaks global state everywhere, you know. So I had to fix some bugs, some real bugs, but mostly fix the test suite. So many of these poor tests I had reached their end of life without ever finding a single real bug, which was the point of them as regression tests, so the tests were very sad. I blamed Magento for being difficult to test, with a good reason, I guess, but I was still convinced that I'm doing the right thing. And in hindsight, I could have done better. Well, what value did all these tests provide? Did I find regressions? As I said, not so much, some only, mostly in the test suite. Did they make me write code faster? Well, if everything worked as expected, yes. Having a fast feedback cycle pays off, but you don't have to try everything in your browser. So I would find and prevent bugs early. But on the other hand, I spent hours and hours fighting with the Magento framework and the test frameworks, and that kind of nullified this benefit. Did they make me write better code? That's also a promise of test-driven development. Well, at least a bit. I tried to design my classes to be more testable, with fewer responsibilities, with better abstractions, but it didn't go far enough. It still was too tied to the Magento standard way that I learned, and which was not designed for testing. Another interesting thing to observe in hindsight, I built all the features as separate modules in separate repositories, so I could gather some data to see how my testing has changed over time in that project. So this is one of the first modules I wrote for Magento, and the blue line is the number of lines of logical lines of code in the module. The red line is the number of lines in test, so it's almost 50-50, that's great. But if we have a look at a module that I started 1 year into the project, and which was developed further, it looks like this. Started to write with some tests, like configuration tests. At some point added 1 or 2 little tests, but mostly I had given up to test everything. The interesting thing is this is a payment module, by the way, so something that's important to test. It was accompanied by a separate service, a Symfony web service. It was not directly communicating with Magento, only over the API. And if we look at the stats there, it's several thousand logical lines of code. And you see for every code change, there's also more tests. It's not exactly 50%, but it's pretty good. So this probably kept me sane to have something not in Magento where I saw tests, unit tests, test-driven development, it can work. Well, meanwhile, I finally finished my studies after a few years of pause because I had kids and wanted to get this university thing out of my life. And for my diploma thesis, I chose a topic that's relevant to my work for totally selfish reasons. And I called it an approach to software construction with unstable PHP frameworks. Guess what's the example? Yeah, of course, Magento. And one of the problems I identified there was unit tests are costly and ineffective. Note that I didn't write inefficient, I wrote ineffective. So I was really desperate at that moment that it just couldn't work. Another one was automated acceptance tests are costly and slow. That's a different problem. And I researched possible solutions for all these problems. And well, one approach was for automating acceptance tests that should make it easier to involve product owner and quality assurance people. It's Fitness, a Selenium-based testing tool run by Robert C. Martin, Uncle Bob, where the test cases are written as Excel sheets. That's the language of the business people, right? So the hope was to write tests in cooperation with the business people. And there was the brief, which provided an additional abstraction to hide the implementation details, to enable, and reuse these details. As a proof of concept, I ported a bunch of tests that were written in the Selenium IDE before to Fitness. And I really liked the result. But actually getting the business people to write tests like this, even though it was Excel, was harder than I expected. I still think it's a good approach. I admire people who successfully apply something like this with behavior-driven development. We are going to hear something about that maybe. And it just didn't work out for our team at that time. Back to real work. I started to work at the same agency where I made these experiments. And their projects were super standardized, all had a continuous integration setup with Selenium-based tests. I made careful attempts to introduce unit tests and test-driven development. We were not successful, let's not talk about that. In the beginning of this, the project where I worked on, the QA team recorded most of the tests using the Selenium IDE in the browser. And then developers would extend and improve them later as needed. There was one flagship project that had been developed from scratch in this way, and it's again interesting to observe this over time in hindsight. As the team grew, the responsibility of writing the tests went more and more to the developers themselves. That's one thing. Then, after a year or so, the test suite was running for over an hour, so when an old test started to fail, the feedback came way too late, like in the afternoon, on the next day. All these tests worked if they were run separately, but didn't work if you run the whole test suite. We have all these test fragility again. So what happened? More and more developers started to ignore the right status for the project, although it was always visible on a big screen in the office. Because, I don't know, some tests were just known to be fragile, and it works, and we need to ship features, right? And another problem was that tests relied on test data that more and more diverged from the real data while the project developed. So most tests were slow and fragile, and the best we could have done with them was skipping them or ignoring them, and then they're not worth anymore. And then 3 years ago, I started working at Internet, my current agency, and frankly, there was no established test culture yet. There were some basic Selenium tests done by QA from themselves. And we are a small expert company with highly individual project, not so much standardization, everybody works as they know best. They have, to their credit, tried to implement testing with EcomDev PHPUnit as well for a few months, then given it up. I can't blame anyone for that. But quite at the beginning, I got the chance to work in a bigger partner project with a well-known German agency. And they had a sophisticated infrastructure, used their own fork of EcomDev PHPUnit with own additions and bug fixes, and automated unit integration tests with that. They monitored test coverage, which really made a difference for me and pushed me to test more, because another confession, my test coverage still sucks today in most projects I work on. And it was nice to get back into unit testing in such a professional team, at least at first. The typical problems that I mentioned earlier still came up, and it got less fun when tests started to fail on CI that worked locally. Then a dooming deadline prevented time to fix the test, so in this situation, developers started to not care about the results. And eventually wrote less tests, that is me included. So to recap the typical problems, especially in Magento 1 integration tests that alter the global state, like singletons and registry, and so influence upcoming other tests. Tests that depend on existing data, but other tests delete the existing data and or use their own. This also includes things like stores and attributes. One test assumes that there is a store. That's something sane to assume. But another test deletes the stores. And, well, then it fails. Then tests are often not well isolated. For example, not running in a database transaction, so they leave their stuff behind and don't clean up after themselves. Related to that, the fixture setup is quite complicated, especially with EcomDev PHPUnit. And, well, I find the same pattern of fragile test suites in Magento 2 integration tests, but not quite as bad. But if it happens, it's similarly frustrating. We'll come to that later. Now, finally, some good news. In 2015, at the Unconference in Berlin, we had a discussion session about unit testing led by Wiener Jakob. He shared an approach that blew my mind and really influenced me. He shared, or the idea was to just use plain PHPUnit for unit tests and write all the business logic independent from Magento. So most of the things I mentioned were related to something with Magento, global state, database, and so on. And if you get rid of that in your tests, you don't have these problems anymore. And to get there, you have to decouple your business logic from Magento. I admit that's hard, but if you get that right and you understand this, it's super worthwhile. I had actually tried to reduce dependencies to Magento before. I even mentioned it in my thesis, if I look back, but I thought of it as an exception, something that's not really possible all the time. And seeing how Vinay does it, and that it actually works, was a turning point for me. I put it in practice right away, rebuilt community extension of us, the internet anonymizer, and it felt like freedom. No constraints by the application framework, no struggling with the test framework. Fast unit tests, super important. TDD without all the frustrations. I have to be honest with you, there's one problem left. You still need these integration tests to make sure that connecting this independent code with Magento works correctly. Less tests, but they still can be difficult. And as of now, this is the best way I found for developing extensions. Separate the business logic from Magento, develop this business logic with unit tests, then have a thin integration layer, which is tested with a separate integration test suite, but doesn't repeat all the logic tests from the unit test suite. Just tests on a high level that everything is tied together directly. This idea is also illustrated in this so-called testing pyramid. Look at the right side, the agile testing pyramid. Most tests should be unit tests, provide a solid base. Then you have less and less higher level tests. And in the end, there should be manual tests, but there actually are no manual tests here in Agile. You'll still have to do some manual tests. That's also important. Well, also interesting here is the unit tests are meant to prevent bugs, not to find them. So you write your tests alongside with your code, and so many bugs just don't happen on production. You prevent them while you write them because you have to execute their code all the time and think about it all the time, and think about all the edge cases. So, to be honest, most projects I work with still look more like the left version. Some test automation, a few unit tests here and there, I work intensively with them, and still lots of manual testing. But I'm more and more getting to the right side. Another things from 2015 where I experimented with other testing frameworks that I want to mention briefly. One is Xtest for acceptance and integration tests, also special, especially for Magento 1. It's not in my default toolset today. I've used it successfully for a shop where I was contracted to clean up and refactor the theme. It has 30 websites, and I didn't want to look at all the websites after each change to see if they still look good. And this Xtest framework has a really nice feature with responsive screenshots to monitor if all pages are still looking good. And you don't need much code to to build a little smoke test suite that does things like open the home page, open a product page, do a search, go to the checkout, and make a screenshot of it in various resolutions, and so you can see immediately if something's looking odd. Another thing I tried out was Magento, which was brand new and branded as the Selenium-based testing framework for people who hate testing. Who here hates testing? Nobody admits? You admit it. I think for all the others, it's still worth looking at. It is, again, from Magento 1, because Magento 2 already has all these testing frameworks, but it provides a great abstraction in PHP. You write it in PHP. You don't need to care about all the low-level browser stuff. You have many building blocks ready to use, and you just have to configure CSS selectors for your own theme. That's something I had expected from the Magento testing framework, the NTAF from Magento 1.9. I don't know if anybody remembers this. We shouldn't talk about that. But this time, it actually worked. Yeah, another thing, not Magento specific, I tried out Codeception, which can execute a wide range of different tests, and it's nice to get started with. Easy to set up, easy to get started. It has two different modes for browser testing. One is actually using Selenium, like controlling the browser. Another one is using HTTP requests via curl. So if you don't need JavaScript, just want to see if the rendered page is looking good, this is a faster alternative. Then a new era begins, Magento 2. It promised to introduce also a new era regarding testing. Magento 2 comes with a huge test suite with all kinds of tests, unit tests, integration tests, functional tests, API tests, different JavaScript tests. And the mantra was, untested code is no code. I don't hear that often anymore, but I think it's still important to remember that. So how did that go for me? My first serious steps with Magento 2 was in the next year, 2016, when I had to port our Solar extension from Magento 1 to Magento 2. And there I had refactored the Magento 1 module first to extract as much as possible into an independent library that I could reuse as it is from Magento 2. And I only needed integration tests to verify that this library was integrated correctly in Magento. Then our first real Magento 2 customer projects, we also use integration tests for almost everything. The integration test framework is quite good, works comparatively well, it's easy to get started with. It's definitely more reliable than the things we had in Magento 1. So finally, I'm not the only one in the company anymore who writes tests. But still, it's sometimes quite frustrating. As easy as it is to get started, it's also easy to get blocked, and you have problems like tests that failed after minor version updates of Magento because of something in the test framework failed. Although there's great effort to keep the tests isolated, so they clean up after themselves in the database, it doesn't work all the time, and if it doesn't work, debugging is not fun. So I still recommend to decouple as much as possible and write only so much integration tests that you need. Well, we had that. And to practice the skill of writing independent code, writing plain PHP code in a test-driven way, I started to make katas a habit. In martial arts, katas are a form of practice with imaginary opponents, where you make the same moves again and again after you master them in your sleep. I don't do martial arts, so my katas are code katas and my moves are unit tests. And the goal of that is to make test-driven development my default habit. Because what happens if you are under stress, like a deadline is coming, or you just want to get that feature done? You fall back to your default habits. And I'd rather have my default habit to be efficient test-driven development than blindly hacking around until something works, which in the end will bite your ass. I've documented a few katas that I've been doing, so you can follow along. The link is in the slides. So we're almost done with my journey. And if I'm looking back, I would begin differently today with what I know today. For a quick win, I probably create a smoke test suite with something like Codeception that's easy to get started, but testing on a very high level gives you a very good return for little investment because it prevents the worst bugs at a low cost. Like you won't ever deploy a page, a shop anymore where you can't access the product page or you can't access the checkout because that has been tested automatically. And be honest, you don't do that manually all the time for every little deployment. If you do, kudos to you, I don't. Meanwhile, to learn test-driven development, do it in small self-contained projects or katas and not in Magento. That's too much to learn at once and will end in frustration. Then if you have gotten into the habit, you can start to build small parts of your code independently from Magento and test drive these parts. And you'll always find some parts where it's more easy than other parts to do this. So start small. Meanwhile, start to add simple integration tests. In Magento 1, I would probably use Xtest. I still, probably for Stockholm Syndrome or something like that, I still use EcomDev PHPUnit because I'm so used to it and know all the ins and outs. But I wouldn't recommend anybody to start with that if he had to do testing in Magento 1, which, yeah, probably nobody anymore does because we are all on Magento 2 now. Also important, if these integration tests get too complicated and you waste hours and hours and hours, it might be worth to skip a few of them. Don't feel ashamed of it. Some mistakes I have made in the past that I want to share with you is selling tests as a separate part of the project quote or estimation. That's not cool because testing should be a tool for you. And I won't ever include PHP Storm as in a quote so that the customer can say, wait, this costs $100 a year? You just use Vim. So the same goes for other tools. It's not part of the quote that you can just leave out because that's the impression. If you say unit tests costs this and that, the impression is, okay, we can leave that out. We don't need that. And that's the wrong impression. It's a tool that you as a developer decide to use, nobody else. Then as a trainer, I won't try anymore to teach beginners unit testing and testing Magento at once. As I said before, it's too much at once. It's different things. And you should learn them separately. Now, we're already in 2017, and I will have a little preview. I'm currently working on a book, Test-Driven Magento by Example. I don't have enough time, or as much time as I want to have, so I'm not giving any date when it's out, but you can follow along on this URL. There's a newsletter, and I'll send out updates from time to time. So I'm very excited about this new project. And so we're done. Other than in unit testing, in real life, failures are okay if you learn from them. So thank you for your attention.